So today we are talking about work, leisure, and media. This is chapter 7, and I'm sure it'll be hugely disappointing to you that this is probably going to be a somewhat shorter chapter, so a shorter video. But a lot of this chapter is stuff that I think is by and large pretty evident. And I think that we're going to cover what we need to cover and move on from there. So what we're going to do is, again, talk about each of these in turn: work, leisure, and media, and adolescents' involvement in all three. And of course, this would constitute work, leisure, and media most of their time that is spent outside of school. So if an adolescent has a job outside of school, that's the work part. If they don't have a job, or after they are finished with their working hours, they certainly are going to participate in leisure activities. And then, of course, we know that media consumption is quite high amongst adolescents, and this is both social media and media, so whether it's TV, movies, binge watching Netflix, whatever. Okay, so one of the things you're going to notice in the text is, of course, they talk about how not that many high school students work. That is more true in the US than in Canada. In Canada, we do see higher rates of adolescents working in high school, so having part-time jobs. But a lot of the same things apply in terms of what type of jobs do adolescents have. So whether we're talking about Canada or the US, most adolescents are working, if they're formal jobs, they're typically retail, food service, and sometimes sort of like fitness-related things. So either they're working at a gym, they're a lifeguard, a swim instructor, a youth sport coach, things like that. And then, of course, there are the informal jobs like babysitting, yard work, things along those lines. So, again, yeah, I probably should look at my notes. I'm telling you, these videos are just like what things are like in class, where I'll like say a bunch of things, then be like, oh, right, there are the points for you to follow along with. So, again, retail and service industries primarily, typically less formal settings for younger adolescents. There are, of course, rules about what age an adolescent has to be in order to work officially. So sometimes they start working before that age in these informal settings, so babysitting, dog walking, snow removal, lawn care, things like that. And some will continue into doing that as they get older. But again, retail and food service and service industries, so to speak, are where we're going to see a lot more adolescents working. So what impact does this have on adolescents? Because on the one hand, you may have worked in high school because your parents said, you know, it'll teach you responsibility if you get a part-time job. Now you can call your parents after you watch this and say, you know, the data doesn't really substantiate that. Thanks for stealing part of my childhood. Please don't do that. I don't want to get hate mail. But the data, in fact, does not fully substantiate that. So research does not support the idea that having a job makes adolescents more responsible. And in fact, depending on how much the adolescent works, it could have negative impacts. Now, one positive that can come out of having a job is that an adolescent does do better with time management, in large part because they have to, because excuse me, their school hours are defined. These are the hours that they have to be at school. Their work hours are defined. These are the hours they have to be at work. And before they can engage in leisure time activities or recreation, they have to get any school work done, any other household responsibilities done. So they have to be able to figure out how to get it all done, given that there's only 24 hours in a day. So it can help with time management, but it could also, if they're working too many hours, and that's not just an arbitrary number of hours, if it's too many hours for them to be able to get all their other responsibilities taken care of, that could have a negative impact as well. Generally, if they're working fewer than 20 hours a week, schoolwork is not affected. But of course, there are going to be exceptions to this. If you have someone who's taking like all advanced placement classes and the hardest options, then working 18 hours a week might be too much. There are going to be cases where someone works more than 20 hours a week and their schoolwork still isn't going to suffer, either because they are just really good at time management, or maybe they have the type of job where they can actually do their homework at work, right? So one of my favorite jobs as an adolescent was a particular babysitting job where the parents liked to put the child to bed, and all I had to do was sit there. So it was a great gig because I would get there like a half hour before the parents were leaving, and I'd get paid for that half hour, so that the child would know I was there in case he woke up. But the parents, because they worked, they liked putting him to bed every night. So they would put him to bed, and then as soon as they put him to bed, they would go out, and I could do homework or watch TV or fall asleep on the couch, as the case may be, until they came back. This child never woke up. I babysat him for 2 years. Never woke up. It was the easiest gig ever. So that didn't impact, and granted, it wasn't 20 hours a week, but it didn't impact my schoolwork at all because I could do homework. I could study while I was there. I knew that I was going to have uninterrupted time because he was such a great sleeper. Now, what we do see is that working has a positive correlation with engaging in problematic behavior. So again, remember, a positive correlation is not necessarily a good thing. A positive correlation means that as we see an adolescent working and working more, we see them engaging in more problematic behaviors. And why is that? Well, when an adolescent has a part-time job, they suddenly have money. They may now have disposable income. They may choose to spend that money on things that their parents might not be fans of, that may not be all that helpful. Things like drugs, alcohol, cigarettes, marijuana, any of those, all of those. Hookers, I guess possibly, I don't know. They also oftentimes have older coworkers who are engaging in some other activities that that adolescent maybe shouldn't be engaging in, but again, with older coworkers, they are because they're exposed to it. So we see that also they may be engaging in some of these activities like drinking and drugs and things like that to deal with their own stress over work, school, relationships, whatever it is. So we do know that there could be some problems that come. So parents hope that having a job makes their adolescent more responsible, but in fact, we sometimes see that those adolescents actually get into more trouble with other problematic behavior. The exception to this is for youth who live in poverty, employment can be positive. There may be some more benefits for them. They might be able to help their household. They're now able to have necessities that maybe they weren't able to have before. So there are some positives that come from that, but that is the exception, not the rule. I see here in my notes that I have a big highlight that says quiz question 9, the answer is C. So for your quiz, question 9, the answer is C. Okay, so that's adolescence and work. Let's move on to leisure because leisure is more fun. So structured leisure activities. Extracurricular activities, athletics are most common. A large number of high school students will participate in sports of some sort, whether it's a team through school or some sort of organized sport outside of school. Certainly, I don't know, I hear hockey is popular in Calgary. So whether it's hockey, whether it's skiing, whether it's figure skating or speed skating or gymnastics or dance, any of those things, those are structured leisure activities. And typically, these structured leisure activities have a positive impact on adolescent development. So some of those same things that you get from having a job in terms of the time management component, that's there. But the other thing is extracurricular activities can give you somewhat of a sense of purpose other than just being a student, just being a son or daughter or an adolescent. If it's an athletic endeavor, it also can satisfy some physical fitness and, health maintenance or health improvement. It also gives you, again, whether it's an athletic thing or whether, it's theater or music or yearbook committee, it gives you contact with other people, right? So you get that working as a team, working with other people, exposure to other people, people who you might not normally hang out with otherwise. So there are lots of ways that this can be really positive for adolescents. It also helpful for some people, gives them something to talk about in college applications, things like that, extracurriculars, they've done stuff. So really overall, we see that extracurricular involvement is positive. Unstructured leisure time, on the other hand, is basically hanging out. So going to the mall with your friends, hanging out with your friends, playing video games, going to a restaurant with your friends so all of you can stare at your screens and not talk to each other to communicate with other people who aren't there with you, because that happens too, right? So unstructured leisure time, just hanging out, does not tend to have such a positive impact on adolescent development. So in that unstructured time, certainly we all need some of it. It's a question of how much, right? So when we look at some of the issues facing adolescents today, certainly we are concerned with a lot of just hanging out, not doing anything productive in terms of potentially weight gain or obesity. So either because just lack of physical activity or also possibly snacking. We also get concerned about screen time if that unstructured leisure time is spent just staring at a screen. We worry sometimes about social connection with so much having moved online, even pre-pandemic, right, with Snapchat and Instagram and all these other things. With so much time being spent online, are we forgetting how to engage with other people and to sort of have a purpose towards that engagement, which structured leisure activities gives us? So there can definitely be some negatives here. This could also cause some more conflict between adolescents and their parents. Their parents want them to go do something. I just want to sit and relax. That becomes a little bit of a sticking point. So now shifting over to thinking about the media component. We're going to talk about this in two different ways. The first, just screen time. The second, social media specifically. So one of the things that we need to be aware of is that adolescents spend approximately 9 hours on a screen every day. So just stop right there for a second. There are 24 hours in a day, 9 of them being spent on a screen. 9 of them. That's more than a third of the day. And presumably they sleep at some point, right? And they should be sleeping. Let's say 8 hours. That's another third. So less than a third of their day is time spent not in front of a screen. And that number is pre-pandemic, before they were all doing school online, right? So now when we factor in pandemic screen time, I don't even want to think about what that number is, right? I don't want to think about it. So obviously, it's a bit of a concern, not because it's, oh my gosh, screen time is terrible, but this is a huge change, right? So adolescents used to go to school, see their friends at school, and then go home from school. And in high school, you would often find, and I remember this from when I was a high school student, it would be like I'd get home from school and I would immediately call my best friend who I just spent the whole day in school with. But eventually, one of my parents would be like, get off the phone, right? And I'd get off the phone and I would do my homework and then I'd get back on the phone. And I can remember my parents being like, you just spent your whole day in school with this person. What could you possibly have to talk about? And it's like, well, the whole day in school, right? Like we were in school, we couldn't talk about. Oh my goodness. But now these screens, and it's everywhere. Because we all have phones. These phones are basically our lifelines, right? How many of you remember other people's phone numbers? Yeah, it's like, I don't know. And there's even like someone who I speak to on a very regular basis. If you were to ask me what their phone number is, I have not a clue because I never dial it because I open my phone and I press their name. An instant phone call. I know each of my parents' cell phone numbers, and I know my husband's cell phone number. That's about where it ends, right? I know my number too. But when I was younger, I had to actually remember numbers. But so screens are a problem in terms of that removal from what's going on around you. And when I said earlier that, excuse me, and that sort of hanging out, adolescents might just go to a restaurant and all sit down and stare at their screens and not talk to each other. That's exactly what's happening. They're sometimes even texting each other sitting at the same table. Talk, right? But we don't do that anymore. We don't really talk to people. So communication skills are taking a hit, and that's a concern. And then, of course, the more time we spend online, we risk being exposed to things that we wouldn't otherwise be exposed to, which isn't always a bad thing, but sometimes it is. And you've also probably noticed that sometimes you'll see an ad appear on a site you're looking at for something that you had been thinking you wanted to look up, but you never even looked up or told anyone you wanted to look up. And it's because artificial intelligence is able to tell from the patterns of what you are looking at, oh, you are the type of person who might be interested in this thing. So that gets a little scary too. And the more time we spend on screens, the more our phones get to know about us. I find it very amusing that specifically to the COVID vaccines, some people have expressed a fear that someone might put a tracking chip in it and embedded in them. And it's like, dude, you carry around a tracking chip all day, every day. And it's not just tracking your movement, it is tracking what you're buying, what you're looking at buying, what weird fantasies you're looking up online, anything you look at. Ian just got nervous at that one. He just looked up and was like, what? Anything and everything you do online, your phone knows. Okay, so this is a concern that adolescents are spending this much time online. Research doesn't provide clear answers as to benefits and risks. We know there are some benefits. We know certainly from an education standpoint there are some benefits. It's certainly easier to do research projects with online access instead of having to go to the library and pull out the encyclopedia that was printed 3 years ago, so all the information is out of date anyway. But we also know that there are some dangers, and particularly with some of the social media sites and with other things as well. Theories of media influence and use. So there's a couple of theories that talk about sort of how do we use media, how do we use our screens, how do we decide what to look at. Cultivation theory emphasizes the impact media exposure has on an individual. So this idea that a violent video game makes you aggressive, right? So if you play a violent video game, you then become aggressive. And that's relatively simplistic, and I don't know quite how accurate. We know there have been research studies that say playing violent video games does not increase aggression. There have been others that say it does. Listening to, death metal increases violence. Listening to death metal calms people down and lowers their blood pressure, right? We find studies both ways. I'm not so sure about the death metal and blood pressure. I might have made that up. Don't quote me, okay? Because again, Ian kind of looked up at that one like, that's interesting. Never heard a doctor prescribe that. Use and gratification approach says that the active role users play in selecting, or it emphasizes the active role that users play in selecting media they're exposed to. So what this means is someone who's already aggressive is going to then pick an aggressive video game. So it's not that the video game makes them aggressive, it's that they're already interested in aggression. They're already aggression, so they're going to get something that reinforces who they are, what they do, right? So they're going to use and be gratified by what they consume. The media practice model says adolescents choose exposure to media and also interpret the media in ways that shape the impact. So again, they choose their exposure to media, so you're not just exposed to everything, but you actually choose. Like when you open up Google, it doesn't tell you where to go. You type in what you're looking for, right? And then it gives you options, so you choose. And maybe you put into the search bar, I don't know, red hats, okay? And the first hit that comes up is one of the red MAGA, Make America Great Again hats. Well, you don't click that link because you're not really interested in that. The next hat that comes up is a Calgary Flames hat. And you're like, No. Next one that comes up is Montreal Canadiens. You're like, yeah, okay, I'm all about that. Not that I have hockey team preferences or anything like that, right? So we choose which link to follow. And then we choose to interpret what we see on that link. Now, the thing is, probably there's, to some extent, each of these theories or each of these models explains part of it. Again, I personally think cultivation theory is a little too simplistic, but it's really hard to know because show me someone who's never used media who we could put in a lab and actually test how they do things. Right? I mean, my daughter's 5 and has already mastered the iPad, and in fact told me that they had iPads in her class at school, and I was like, what now? Right? Because we really try to restrict her screen time. And she's like, well, yeah, they have a couple of learning apps on them, and we only get them every now and then if we've been like really good and done everything we needed to do. And I'm like, okay, interesting. But I also know that at her school in grade 1, she will get a school-issued iPad for school stuff. But we can't get adolescents into a lab who have never used media before unless we get Amish teens on their little break from Amish life. So a little side note, where I used to live in New York, there were quite a few Amish communities. And when Amish teenagers are about 16, I think, they get, and I'm not going to say it properly, but it's something along the lines of Ungesplatze, which basically means it's their chance to go off and be free. There was actually a series on, I think it was TLC, called Amish in the City or something like that, that basically followed Amish teenagers when they were going off, and they get to have basically 2 years where they can go off into the world and do all the things that Amish people generally don't do. But then at the end of that time period, they have to decide if they are going to remain part of the Amish community or if they are going to live in the world. And if they choose to live in the world, they are immediately cut off from their family and their community. So it's an interesting time. Those would be just about the only people we could get, but how would we even find them, right? Like, I can't drive up to an Amish farm and be like, when is your next child going to have their free time so I can know the precise minute they walk out the door before they go to the 7-Eleven and buy a cell phone with a prepaid SIM card, because I have to catch them before they have consumed any media whatsoever. And then also, would their experience consuming media be the same as other teenagers? Well, no, because they've grown up with none whatsoever. So we can't really study this in a good way, which is why we don't have all the answers. Okay. And then, of course, exposure to controversial media content, sex, violence, and drugs. I don't know why that's always controversial. I mean, I know, but I don't, right? I think calling sex content controversial, I think, is part of what gets us into this problem where people can't even say the names of body parts without giggling and turning red, because it's like, oh no, we're talking about sex. No, you're talking about anatomy. Anatomy is not sex. A naked human body is not sex. It's a naked human body, people, okay? So we have to get a little bit past that. But there's also an appropriate time and an inappropriate time to see people engaging in sexual activity. And there's an appropriate time and inappropriate time to make the connection that other people's naked bodies, and while they're engaging in certain acts, might be arousing to you, right? So that's really what we have to be careful of. So we do still restrict access to porn generally to people who are over 18. But again, on the internet, could you work around that if you wanted to? I'm sure there are tons of teenage boys who will teach you how, right? And I say that just because typically men consume much more porn than women, but there's porn out there for women too, I'm sure, right? Violence, well, we're exposed to violence in the news every day. So that's a tricky one too, right? So should we be letting 8-year-olds watch anything that Quentin Tarantino directed? No. That's a hard no, right? That one I'm pretty clear on. But at the same time, some of the things that happen in the world around us in terms of violence, well, that could be out of a Tarantino movie. So, So we do try to protect children. We try to restrict what they see. Adolescents, of course, and particularly younger adolescents, always want the forbidden fruit, the thing that their parents don't want them to see. So they might be more prone to seek some of this out. And same thing with drugs. We don't really want to expose young children and younger adolescents to representations of drug use on screen. We want to try to limit that. We want to make sure that they get some proper education before they see how pleasurable it can be, because they have to know that there are consequences to that pleasure. If you watch a movie where someone's doing cocaine, it looks like that's a great time. You have to know about the consequences. You have to know about the crash. You have to know about the risk of addiction. You have to know about the cost and what people will do to get access to it before. You have to make an informed choice. If you want to use Coke, make an informed choice, okay? So these are all, of course, things that we are concerned about adolescents consuming on screen. In addition, the exposure to sex in the media particularly is problematic for adolescent girls in terms of body image, because the images you see of who is portrayed as sexy is that perfect body that most women cannot achieve. Adolescent girls are already dealing oftentimes with fragile self-esteem related to body image in particular, so that can be problematic. And finally, social media. No clear answers again on whether social media is good or bad for adolescents. Sort of the best conclusion we can come to at this stage is that the socially rich get richer and the socially poor get poorer. So that's kind of a spin off of the expression, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, which is pretty much how our society operates, right? If you're starting out from a place of wealth, it's easier to build more wealth. If you're starting out from a place of poverty, you continue getting poorer. A place like Money Mart charges a much higher interest rate on a loan than the bank does, but the bank won't give you a loan unless you have collateral, unless they feel pretty secure that you're going to pay it back. So if you don't have that, if you're poor, you go to Money Mart, they charge you exorbitant fees and interest, and you actually get poorer for having borrowed money, whereas someone else goes to the bank is like, yeah, you're a pretty good risk. They loan you the money, you pay it back on time, you also figure out how to save a little along the way, boom, you make more money. Same idea with social media, we think, for adolescents, that adolescents who are already pretty adept at social skills, who have friends, who are fairly popular, they go on social media and they build up their followers, their likes, and all that. Adolescents who are on the poorer side of social skills, friends, and popularity, they go on social media and they get ignored on social media just like they do in person, which of course would make them feel even worse, right? So the socially rich get richer, the socially poor get poorer. And then finally, we have to consider problematic social media use. So compulsive internet use, which is basically internet addiction, can be problematic. They talk in the textbook about an experiment done by a 10th grade teacher who asked her students to give up all media devices for a week. And some of them talked about like how hard it was, like they found themselves like reaching for their phone. It's really hard. And admittedly, when I think about like going on vacation for a week and just not having my phone and not having access to anything, I can't quite fathom it, right? Like I can't fathom how I would do that. The reality is, it would probably be lovely. I'd probably sleep more and read more books and maybe even talk to the people I live with. I don't know, maybe, right? So there's that. But we do want to be aware that compulsive internet use can become an addiction. And then, of course, with adolescents, sexting is another potentially problematic area. So this kind of ties into that other area of concern for social media and adolescents, which is sexting, luring, having people who pretend to be a teenager who in fact are older men who are trying to lure you for sex trafficking purposes or for prostitution or because they're pedophiles. So those are certainly issues for adolescents, male and female. And of course, sexting is problematic because if you take a picture of your body and text it to someone else, you have no control over what they do with it. So these are the type of things that adolescents really need to be informed about. Also, and I will say this, I mean, I'm not like some prissy prude, but like, I don't want unsolicited dick pics showing up, right? Like, does anybody ever really want a dick pic? Like, no. So again, be careful about these things, be aware of these things. If you are going to work with adolescents, be aware of these things. Adolescents will pretty much always outsmart parents when it comes to technology. And I certainly am not going to say, oh, if you're the parent of an adolescent, you should totally be taking their phone every day and swiping through it and seeing what they've been up to. You want to be able to trust your adolescent, but I think being proactive about talking about these things can be really important. Having adolescents realize what can happen if this stuff gets out there and is attached to them. Depending on the age of the adolescents in a relationship, it could be considered child pornography if they are texting pictures to one another. So there's a lot of different aspects to consider. Okay, and this brings us to our additional material for discussion, which is the article. So please read the article prior to our class meeting and prior to taking the quiz. It's Vannucci and Macaulay Ohanessian. Social media use, subgroups differentially predict psychosocial well-being during early adolescence, so focusing on our younger adolescents. And for your reflection, you may want to use these questions as a guide. Why do you think the role of social media changes over the course of adolescence and emerging adulthood? Why do you think high Instagram and Snapchat use is related to friends and social support? And is there anything surprising to you about which social media platforms early adolescents were using in this study?